Villagers are attacking. Again.
The game has been rigged. Forget all the rules. Stop believing what you're told. All this hate that I feel for you, my one true enemy. Once was blind, but now I see. It makes me question why.
So originally I actually had no plans to do this, but enough people have asked me about the game, and I know I did review the original and most of the series, so it makes sense that you'd want to hear my thoughts on the Resident Evil 4 remake. And it's good. I feel weird saying that, because I played devil's advocate when it came to the original RE4. I was never a major fan of it, and I never really fully understood why people loved it to such an extent. Like, I don't want to say I didn't understand it, because I got what it did for gaming and the series as a whole, but it hadn't aged well, and it did have flaws. It was not the perfect experience that it was hailed as, and I maintain that to this day. But it's still a good game, and I can acknowledge that. Just because I personally wasn't a big fan of it doesn't mean other people can't enjoy it. I'm not going to pretend like anyone else is wrong just for liking RE4, because, yeah, I get it, okay. But I still think it was the reason why Capcom went in that action direction and ultimately led to RE6, which is still terrible and always will be as far as I'm concerned. But now we have RE4 Remake, which is an interesting game in general on the basis of content, because a lot of people didn't really want this to be remade. The fans of RE4 are very, very vocal when it comes to that particular game, and when it was announced that they were actually remaking it, there was a lot of, shall we say, questionable responses. A lot of people were debating it after RE3 got remade, because once RE3 was remade, they were really done with the tank controls of the old main series games. RE4, it felt like a lot of people didn't feel like it needed to be remade at all. I didn't care either way, I wasn't that invested. But RE4, the original, has not aged as well as people say it has. Like, at all. It hasn't. So it being remade does make sense to update the controls, and mostly I feel the big difference in terms of the control scheme is the addition of the right analog stick to aim, thus reserving the left stick to moving around. Unlike the original RE4, and more like the previous remakes that we've seen since RE2 Remake and RE3 Remake, you can aim and move around, which, thank you. Thank you for that. As a result, the game is a lot more fluid in terms of controls. It feels really good to play. Visually, it is stellar, and the sound design in general is phenomenal. So no complaints there, of course. But how much is really different from RE4 Remake to the original RE4 beyond that control change? The truth is, not a whole heck of a lot, but enough that I feel like it's an entirely different experience in general. Much like RE2 Remake and RE3 Remake, I would argue that they're not necessarily replacements for the original games, more as reimaginings in a partnership with the original games. Just because you play RE2 Remake doesn't mean you can't go back and play the original Resident Evil 2, because they are very different games. The same can be said for RE3 Remake, which I adore, but you can still go back and play the original Resident Evil 3 and get a completely different experience. It is no different here. Yeah, RE4 Remake probably has more in common with RE4 than the other remakes do, with their respective, previous games. But it does enough that's so different that I would say that it's a completely different experience. And that's really relevant to me, and I feel like this is why Capcom's been doing remakes really well. They're not trying to replace their old games to make you feel like you shouldn't go back and play them. They're just trying to reimagine them and give slightly new experiences, but that are familiar. It's almost a nostalgia trip seeing these kind of games remade, where, yeah, you remember the original, I remember that, but it's different. It's a different coat of paint, it's different mechanics, it's different enough where it's a new experience with something familiar. And I think that's the best way to do a remake in general, where you're doing enough to be obviously the same kind of experience when compared to the original, but different that it can stand on its own. And that's what all the Resident Evil remakes have done, with the sole exception of the original's remake. The remake of the original Resident Evil, yeah, they are still different experiences, but in my opinion, this is just me, the remake of the original Resident Evil is just outright better than the first game. It doesn't add enough to be that different. It still has the same controls, unless you're playing a very new version, which does have a different control setup to make it easier to play, but it's so similar, to the point that it's basically just a graphical overhaul with a couple additions, that I almost say there's no reason to play the original because you're gonna laugh at it if you played the, remake like I did, because the voice acting was, well,
Jill Sandwich.
that. But as for RE4 Remake, what do we have here? How do they change it? How do they make it different? Well, I think the biggest difference, in a couple of ways, is the addition of stealth mechanics. The idea of stealth kills, the idea of sneaking around, this is now a viable option in the game, and you can go through a significant portion of it by sneaking, which is something I always attempted to do. Not only does this make much more logical sense given Leon's background as a trained agent, but I just like having the choice. The original Resident Evil 4 pretty much never gave you this option at all. Like, outside of a few exceptions, it was pretty much a run-and-gun game. You really couldn't sneak. It was not really a viable choice to do that. But in this game, there's almost a focus on it, where they've really made it so that it's something that players can choose to do if they want. Now, if you want to go loud all the time, yeah, you can do that. By all means, you can play it run and gun, just like the original. But the point here is that there's now an option for something different. Players of the previous game can now play through something very similar and do something different with it. Play it in a different style. There's also a lot of focus on the knife combat here, where Leon is able to parry with his knives, and this is critical, especially in the early game, where ammo isn't as prevalent as it will be later. So you're gonna find yourself using this kind of knife combat, and it's very, very dirt simple in its execution, where there's a parry button and a slash button, that's pretty much all there is, but it works, which is kind of the relevant point here. And it's certainly more in-depth than the original game's knife combat, which was literally just slashing. The weapons and everything else are about what you'd expect if you've played the original game. Aiming is top tier, and of course there's the merchant who will allow you to buy, well, whatever you need, because he exists on a plane of existence far beyond the realm of mortal understanding. I'm convinced he's a god of capitalism in the Resident Evil universe. That's the only explanation I can think of for how he's able to do what he does. But I'm glad he's here. He's very friendly, his prices are outrageous. But, whatever, I'll take it. It's fine. Beggars can't be choosers right now, and Lord knows I need a shotgun. Enemy variety is actually pretty much identical with the original game. There really wasn't much I noticed that was all that different, though certain elements of the plot have been shifted around to make things make a lot more sense, actually. Now, I still have a really hard time dealing with the notion that this community in Spain has apparently not frickin' entered into any kind of modern age with their aesthetic, with their clothes, with everything. Like, where is this in Spain where it's decades behind everywhere else in the world? I don't get that. And again, you go to the castle and suddenly they're using medieval flails. Like, what is the deal? It's only late in the game that they finally give them guns, which is just like the first game where it's like, we didn't want to give them guns early, so we made them use pitchforks. Like, this is apparently a really rural community, and yeah, a rural community is great. I just feel it begs for some kind of explanation, but at the same time, the original RE4 had that too, so hey, whatever. In terms of which game is better or worse, I think they're two different experiences entirely. Do you want straight up action, or do you want the option of stealth? The remake is also way darker than the original game. Not in tone, it's pretty much the same in that way, but in terms of aesthetic, it's night like all the time in the remake, which can make certain situations feel way scarier because it's always dark. I swear, once the sun went down in this game, it never came up again, and that happens pretty quick. There are certain sections I distinctly remember from the original being well lit. That is no longer the case in the remake, but it does add that element of fear in that it's kind of difficult to see sometimes. So there's that to consider. Inventory system is pretty much identical to the original game with the sole exception of an amazing button that auto-sorts your equipment, which, yes, thank you for that. I understand that some people enjoyed manually sorting all their items in the attaché case, but I did not, and having the choice to simply hit a button and have it done automatically for me is such a time saver. There are a plethora of items in the game because, yes, of course there are. This is RE4 where everyone drops something, and for some reason, even though these farmers don't have guns, they always drop handgun ammo, but it's a video game, so whatever. And I do think Leon was handled a lot better in terms of his tone. In the first game, they went ultra-secret agent with him, which just feels wrong for Resident Evil. I get he is an agent, but during the time the original was made, that was kind of all the rage, where everyone felt the need to be James Bond. Even the original Metal Gear Solid, the remake, Twin Snakes, made Solid Snake out to be kind of a James Bond element who jumps off missiles and stuff. It's ridiculous. Here, Leon is much more down-to-earth and much more realistic. Yeah, he does pretty awesome feats, but it still stays fairly grounded, where generally, instead of doing ridiculous flips and stuff like they did all the time in RE4, for the most part, he does typical close-quarters combat stuff, as if he was trained by Special Forces, which he was. So, in that way, Leon feels a lot more understandable in terms of his background. Plus, they directly reference Resident Evil 2, and the notion that Leon is kind of suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, because, duh, of course he would. And I love the remakes for this element. The fact they're trying to humanize the main cast, where, yeah, these people are capable of pretty great things, they're awesome combatants, they're able to deal with a significant amount of stress, but it does wear on them. They're still people, and having to deal with the afterthoughts of the kind of horrors they've witnessed, quite literally, does affect their mindset. Leon is no exception to this. Yeah, he put himself into this situation by becoming an agent, but he was invited based off of his record when it came to what happened in Raccoon City, and he felt like facing it was the only way to deal with it. Whereas in the original RE4, they don't really address this at all. He just kind of shows up and he's like, yeah, I'm Leon, and I'm really cool. And that's pretty much the extent of his development. Here he feels more real, and I kind of appreciate that about it. Plus, the supporting cast like Ada is phenomenal, as well as Ashley. Ashley has been given a retool to make her slightly less annoying in terms of personality, but I feel like that makes her a little less realistic in reality, if I'm being honest. Because, like, yeah, I get it. She was loud and obnoxious in RE4, I agree, but also, she was a college girl and the daughter of the president. She basically had been pampered her entire life and she was thrust into this situation. Of course she's gonna act like kind of an idiot sometimes. Here, she's a bit smarter, at least in terms of how she's dealing with it, but I feel like she's dealing with the situation a little too well, if you ask me. Leon does have to sit down and console her on occasion, so she still feels kind of realistic, but I feel like she doesn't panic quite as much as she should, but maybe that's because they were trying to tone it down, because that got on people's nerves, so, okay, make Ashley a little stronger of a character, that's fine with me. What I do mind about Ashley is her gameplay, because they changed how the escort works. In the original game, there were two functions: follow and wait here. That was it. Here there are still two functions, but wait here has been dropped entirely. There's actually two different kinds of follow. Follow close and follow at a distance. There's also still the option to let her hide in lockers and stuff just like the original game had, but my problem here is that both of the follows in the remake are equally annoying when you're trying to run past enemies. Neither of them really seems to make that any easier. It's always a chore, no matter what, because her AI is entirely unpredictable. You'd think it would be predictable based on the fact there's two different settings for it, but it really doesn't change Ashley running into stuff. There was a scripted event where you're running from the village leader, and I swear Ashley ran straight into an enemy and got caught. I lost that section because she's an idiot. I played it through the exact same way the second time, and she ran past the enemy this time. My problem here is this. Why can't I tell her to wait somewhere? Beyond the locker thing, which, yes, is there, I acknowledge that, but there are other situations where it would be really nice and really convenient if I could just be like, hey, how about you stay right here? Do not move, and let me deal with all this. I did that a few times in the original, and it worked really well, because it's nice not to have to worry about her if you just go out and kill the enemies in an area and make sure they stay away from her. But in this game, I don't really have that option unless I find somewhere for her to hide. Outside of that, she has to follow you somehow, and that could be really aggravating. It's like the one element of this game where I think is actually worse than the original. I get people have praised her AI for some reason, and I don't really get that because in the original, yeah, the AI was dirt simple, but it worked. Follow and stay. That was it. And both were useful in certain situations. Here, it's always some kind of follow, and neither one is useful in situations where you just do not want her to follow you. Outside of that, though, the redesigns of everything are actually pretty great, gunplay feels good, and it still feels like RE4 but with a new coat of paint. Again, being able to sneak around is nice, and there are plenty of situations where I felt like, it was a fun game, though I do admit, this is another element that I kind of really drives me nuts, they didn't really shorten the game at all. It's still just as long as it always was. In fact, I think they added more to it in some areas. Some people may like that if you're a fan of RE4 and you wanted more. I have talked to some fans that say they wanted the game to be longer, so I understand that. I always felt like RE4 was padded out a little bit. Now, to be fair, the plot here has been retooled a little bit in a way that makes more sense and gives me more content to work with. So I never really felt like, outside of a handful of sections, that the game was dragging that much, but I do feel like the castle and the early village probably could have been streamlined just a little bit, just a hair, and it probably would have made me like the game a little bit more, but it wasn't that big of a deal. I just felt like I should point out that if you were like me, and you felt like the original RE4 was too long, and you're hoping the remake will fix that problem, it won't. It will still be just as long, for the most part, but there's more to see in the remake in terms of the lore, so it's kind of an even trade-off if you're interested in the narrative. I feel like the narrative was handled a lot better in terms of character interactions. Ada was wonderful. I loved how they handled her in this game. Her and Leon's relationship is actually one of my favorite elements of Resident Evil. Your ship is wrong if it isn't Wong, just so we're clear. But I also heard that people were harassing her voice actress for, apparently being bad. I didn't feel like she was that bad. Did she give, like, an Oscar-winning performance? No, but she was fine. Maybe it's because she replaced the one from RE2 who everyone liked. But going and harassing a voice actor or actress or anyone for their role in a game, like, they're just a performer. They were asked to do a job, and they were given direction by a director in the studio. So if Capcom accepted those and didn't ask for retakes, then that's on them, not her. So you guys need to chill with that, okay? Gamers have gotten so entitled with this kind of stuff. Ada is fine, and I love her portrayal in this game. Frankly, I really did enjoy my time with it. I can see myself playing this again sometime, though I don't know when. Probably not immediately. I really did like RE4's remake, I did. And that's probably because it is different than the original RE4, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Because a lot of people online have been pointing out how much better the remake is. Oh my god, it's RE4 but even better. Oh my god, it's RE4 but even better. As if RE4 never existed. And it's weird for me to put in a position to defend the original RE4 as someone who wasn't a big fan of it, but I don't really consider the remake a replacement for RE4. I consider it just an addition, just a new way to experience it. And, like, some people are just throwing the original in the dumpster as if it never existed. Now we have the remake, we don't need you anymore. And I feel like that's not fair to the original RE4 at all. Like, whether or not I like it or not is irrelevant. It revitalized Resident Evil, and it was many people's entry point. So I still think it deserves plenty of respect. You blasted kids with your remakes. You weren't there, okay? You weren't there with us. You don't know nothing about gaming. Coming in here with your Roblox and your Fortnites and your whatever kids play. I don't even know anymore. The RE4 remake is good, though, so I would recommend it if you were a fan of the first one. But expect it to be a little bit different. Because it is. Do I like it better? Yeah, but maybe not everyone will. Some people might actually like the original a bit more. It's more well lit. In some ways it's scarier since you can't move and shoot. And Ashley's AI, I stand by this, I will die on this hill, was better in the first game. You can fight me on that, okay? Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.